today I'm going to be fitting a spare wheel carrier to this Defender, which I've been wanting to do for ages. But before we do that, let's have a little chat, because the world of spare wheel carriers is a minefield. I've been searching for a spare wheel carrier for a while. I had some work done on this vehicle in South Africa where they took some rust out, and when I got it back, they had taken the spare wheel carrier off the back of the door. Nobody knew it had disappeared. So I've been without a spare wheel for ages. And so I looked into getting one of the ones that take the pressure off wheel hanging on the back of the door and mount to the rear cross member to take all the weight so that you can open the door without having this massive 25 kg or 30 kg wheel hanging off the back of it. But the price of these things is insane. Now, I love a good bit of branded gear as much as the next Land Rover enthusiast, but I am not spending 800 to 1,300 pounds on a spare wheel carrier. I mean, no. I went for the standard Britpart one. I read a few forums and guys have had them on for 6, 7, 8, 10 years and not had a problem with them. So why would I spend £1,000 on a spare wheel carrier? I love the one from Frontrunner. I think the ORE one looks incredible. There's a Nakatananga one for £1,200. It's wild. I mean, it's got to carry a spare wheel, for crying out loud. I mean, why? How? It's not. Why? I don't get it. For me, the Britpart one is hopefully going to solve all those issues, and hopefully I won't eat my words and have to grovel back to you guys saying, yeah, maybe I should have gone for a more expensive one. The next rung up, I thought, let me check out the Mantec one, or the Terra Firma one, or the Safety Gear one. The Terra Firma one was tempting, but I just don't think it looks very nice. It's kind of emphasizing the branding, and I want a discreet wheel carrier. It must just be functional and it must work and last. So let's give Britpart a chance. The Britpart swing away wheel carrier for the Defender came in just under £285, including shipping. That's quite a bit cheaper than the next branded alternative. Britpart used to make one that had these grease nipples on the pivot points, and I wanted that one, but I couldn't find it for sale anywhere. In the box you get the main carrier, a plate that fits on the back door, and a sliding piston mechanism. You also get all the brackets and the fixings. It's not too complicated, but I wanted to make sure I had a good idea of how this all goes together, because I have trust issues with Land Rovers and cheaper parts. The new plate, which holds the nylon piston, will bolt through existing holes on the back door, so first I had to drill out and remove the original backing plate, which is just riveted in. I cleaned up the holes with a slightly larger drill bit and then tidied up. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to answer questions about why my children's feet are bleeding. There are a bunch of different holes on this backing plate, so it can accommodate a few different year models, offering various bolt-through configurations. Mine is pre-2002, so I had to find out which holes lined up. The instructions don't mention it, but you basically have to be an orangutan to fit this on your own. Once it was on, it didn't look quite right. It sat low and none of the other holes lined up besides the 4 main holes. There's nothing in the instructions about orientation, but I thought it was worth flipping it around just to check. Mercifully, this did the trick, and then most of the holes lined up, but it still sat a little bit wonky. The only thing I could think of was to drill the holes out a little bigger to give me some more room for adjustment. Now I could fasten the backing plate down nice and straight because I know it's in the correct place, and there'll be further wiggle room for adjustment when I fit the sliding piston. Speaking of, this sliding piston mechanism bolts onto the plate in the direction facing the rear door latch. But don't tighten it down just yet, it needs to be lined up first. The top pivot bracket requires you to violate your Defender. Now, I hate drilling holes in my Land Rover because it could mean corrosion further down the line. And so it's worth mentioning that with the ORE wheel carrier you don't need to drill any holes, but you do have to pay for the privilege. which is some 500 pounds more than the Britpart one. Once the rivets were drilled out, I opened it up to an 11mm hole, again for some adjustment. I know you're supposed to paint it once it's drilled, but I used Lanoguard. The top bracket bolted through to a captive nut plate, which was supplied with the kit. And this sounds simple, right? But how am I going to do that? It had me running around wondering how I'd reach the bolt on one side and the plate on the other with the great big door in the way. But fortunately, my arms had stretched from installing the back door plate. But even so, I needed something to sit on. Smooth. The trouble I kept having was that I would get one bolt through and thread it onto the plate behind, but then the other bolt just would not line up. I battled on for about an hour or so, but eventually conceded and called over my neighbor for a second pair of hands and eyes. We got it lined up and fitted, and I also left it loose for some future adjustments. Next up was the lower bracket that bolted to the rear cross member and will essentially carry the bulk of the weight. It also bolts through existing holes, but rather annoyingly, you have to drill these out a little bigger to accommodate the supplied bolts. I did paint these holes and use a little Lanoguard because these rear cross members melt like candy floss in the rain. I rushed to finish installing the bracket because a friend showed up for a visit, but I still had one weird looking part left over which I couldn't figure out where it went. This little guy. So I tightened up the remaining bolts and called it a day. The next morning it was absolutely chucking it down with rain, and I knew the last part of this job required me to be on the ground, reaching up awkwardly into the rear end of my Defender, fastening nuts and bolts. So I put on my vegan repeller hat and moved the Landy as close to undercover as I could. Yeah, pretty soggy this morning, but I don't have another opportunity to get this wheel carrier on. So, in England, if you stop for the rain, nothing will ever get done. So I'm going to jump straight back to it. And after a dry fit of the wheel carrier, I remembered that leftover part. There's no clear instruction on what this is, so the only logical conclusion I can come to is that the long bolt on the bottom bracket goes through the cross member on two sides and it's hollow in between. So I think this goes inside the cross member as a spacer so that you don't tighten down and bend your cross member. Anyway, let's fill it with grease and do that. First, I had to loosen the long bolt and take it most of the way out so I could slide the now identified spacer into the rear cross member cavity. But not all Land Rovers are the same, I guess, and this spacer didn't fit, so I forced it, and then it got stuck, and I couldn't get it out again, or even reposition it. Tensions rose as the rain poured onto my face, so I couldn't see, my hand ached trying to squeeze into an awkward position, and my trousers were soaked through. Eventually I snapped, and I had to take a minute and reassess my life choices. After some time, I got the spacer out, and decided to file it down for an easier fit. Then, back under the car, feeling confident again, I had another go. And this time it worked. I got slightly overexcited, but take this as a reminder to always celebrate the small victories in life. Got it! This is the wheel carrier, which is upside down. Ow! It pivots on those 2 points and connects to that sliding piston thing. So I've got to offer up the back of this slot over there onto the end of that threaded piston thingy. Now I'm sorry Britpart, but your instructions are terrible. It just says remove M12 nut from end of sliding mechanism. There's 2 nuts and 3 washers. What comes off? What stays as a spacer? What goes in front? Is it 2 nuts that lock together in the end so it doesn't vibrate loose? What do you want from me? Britpart never heard or responded to my rant, so I went ahead with my own plan and mounted the carrier onto the sliding piston with both nuts and a washer on the outside. The idea being that the 2 nuts will tighten against each other, locking it all in place. If this is wrong, please let me know in the comments below. I know it looks a bit janky at the moment, but I left it like this until everything was in place before tightening it all together.
I then had to install the main pivot bolts while sliding in a washer which acts as a spacer. It was a snug fit, and I ended up having to tap it in with a Deblo hammer to get it all lined up. At some point in the next few months, I guess I'll take it all apart and shove some fresh grease in there. Now that it was all together, I could start lining it up, making sure it opens and closes smoothly, and then tighten down all the components which were left loose for adjustment. It's a fiddly process, getting the tools in behind the carrier, but that gives me a little confidence, knowing it would be quite tricky to steal.
Well, that's all buttoned up now, that's tight, and I think it's moving nice and freely on the door, so I'm going to offer up the spare wheel, but before I can do that, I've got to nick a couple of wheel nuts off of the existing wheels, but I'll replace them with some locking wheel nuts.
I picked up a set of 5 locking wheel nuts with a key from lrparts.net for about $25. I'm not sure anyone would steal these wheels, but I'd rather not find out. And now finally the moment it's all been leading up to, watching me struggle to get the wheel onto the carrier. These are Wolf steel rims, so they're on the heavy side, about 35 kilos I think. But at least I have a spare wheel actually attached to the vehicle now.
I'm chuffed. You can't argue with that. That looks great. For $300 compared to what else is on the market, I think I'm happy with that. The instructions were a little bit funky, but if that's the bottom of the range, I'm okay with that. It looks great. It's not drawing attention. It doesn't have big logos on it. It's subtly, quietly doing its job. As for its build quality, it's steel, powder-coated steel. I can't see how that's going to go too wrong. So I'm okay with that. I mean, 300 quid as opposed to 700, 800, 900 pounds for a wheel carrier. All day long. All day long. Hey, I'm unashamedly going to use a Britpot component. I don't see what all the hype is about. I'll let you know how it goes over the next couple of years. I don't foresee a situation where I'm going to get fed up with it and throw it away. Don't know. It's another piece of the puzzle completed on this vehicle. So, hope that was helpful. Hope it was entertaining at least. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.